April 1945. The war in Europe was burning out, but no one told the men still fighting on the front lines. The roads of Germany were littered with wrecked vehicles. The air smelled of diesel and gunpowder, and exhausted soldiers on both sides prayed for the same thing, an end. But amid the chaos, one moment would stand out as almost impossible. The moment when 300 German soldiers laid down their arms to a single American tank. It began in a shattered German village not far from the Elbe River. The US Army was advancing rapidly, pushing deeper into the heart of the Third Reich. Entire towns were surrendering as Nazi resistance crumbled. But isolated units still fought on, cut off, desperate, and unsure of what awaited them if they didn't give up. That morning, a lone Sherman tank from the 743rd Tank Battalion rumbled down a country road. Its treads clattered against cobblestones as the tank crew peered through their periscopes, unsure what lay ahead. They were out of radio contact, low on fuel, and unaware that just beyond the next bend were hundreds of German troops, entrenched and ready for a fight. But what happened next would defy logic, strategy, and even the rules of war. In a moment that blurred the line between courage and insanity, one American tank would face down an entire enemy force and win not with firepower, but with sheer audacity. This is the story of that incredible encounter, a moment frozen in time that revealed not only the fear and fatigue of war's final days, but also the strange, human instincts that emerge when men realize the battle is truly over. By the spring of 1945, Germany was crumbling from within. The once proud Reich, which had dominated Europe for 6 long years, was now reduced to shattered cities and scattered, leaderless armies. The Allied invasion from the west and the Soviet advance from the east had compressed what was left of the German war machine into a shrinking pocket of chaos. Every day, convoys of weary American soldiers pushed deeper into German territory, their boots treading through the ruins of towns that had been bombed into silence. For many, the war felt all but won, and yet no one dared to relax, not when every hedgerow, every farmhouse could still hide a desperate enemy waiting to strike. For the men of the 743rd Tank Battalion, this uncertainty had become routine. They had fought their way from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany, watching the tides of war shift from fierce resistance to disorganized retreat. But even now, when the end seemed near, danger lingered around every corner. Reports filtered in of scattered German units refusing to surrender, of fanatical SS officers rallying broken troops for one last stand. And somewhere between those collapsing front lines rolled one of the battalion's Shermans, a medium tank nicknamed Easy Betsy. Her crew had survived months of brutal fighting. They were veterans of hedgerow ambushes, tank duels, and freezing winter nights in the Ardennes. Now they found themselves driving through a landscape that no longer looked like a battlefield but like the aftermath of one. Smoke drifted lazily from burnt-out barns and the corpses of war machines. Half-buried Panthers, overturned trucks, twisted artillery lined the roads. Civilians emerged from cellars with haunted faces, clutching children and waving tattered white flags made from bedsheets. For them, the war had already ended. For the Americans, it was still one day too soon to believe it. The orders were simple: advance toward a small village a few miles beyond the Elbe River and clear it of any remaining enemy presence. But simple rarely meant safe. Intelligence in those days was patchy, outdated, or simply wrong. What reconnaissance planes saw from above often didn't match what the soldiers found on the ground. And so the crew of Easy Betsy, 5 men bound by fire and fear, moved forward cautiously, their eyes scanning the ridgelines, their fingers resting near triggers. The air was heavy with that strange tension that comes only in the final act of war, the kind where everyone knows it's almost over. But death refuses to get the message. To the left and right, columns of prisoners trudged west under guard, their grey uniforms blending into the muddy fields. To the east, the horizon glowed faintly red, where the Soviets were burning through the last defenses of Berlin. Inside the Sherman, the men spoke little. Their tanks smelled of oil and steel, and the lingering trace of cordite from their last firefight. Each man's face bore the hollow-eyed look of someone who had seen too much. But they pressed on, driven by duty, momentum, and that unspoken desire to make it home, alive. Little did they know that ahead of them lay One of the strangest encounters of the entire war, a moment that would see their single tank confront not a handful of stragglers, but hundreds of armed German soldiers, a moment where fear, fatigue, and the sheer absurdity of war would collide in the most unexpected way. And in that moment, history would once again prove that the end of a war is never as simple as surrender. It's a series of human decisions made in the shadow of exhaustion and survival. The road leading into the village was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that soldiers learn to distrust, the silence before a storm. The Sherman tank rumbled forward slowly, its treads grinding over gravel and broken cobblestone. To the left and right, fields stretched out, scarred by shell craters and burned-out vehicles. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell swung limply in the wind, its sound long silenced by artillery fire. Inside the tank, Sergeant Tom Ridge, the commander, scanned through his periscope, eyes narrowing as the village appeared ahead, a cluster of stone houses, smoke curling lazily from chimneys that somehow still stood. "Keep your eyes peeled," Ridge muttered to his crew. "If they're still in there, they'll be waiting." The gunner, Corporal Frank Hayes, rested his hand on the turret controls, ready to traverse at the first sign of movement. Beside him, the loader, Private Jenkins, clutched a high-explosive round, sweat glistening on his forehead despite the cold. They'd been ambushed too many times to assume an empty street meant safety. As the tank crept closer, the Americans noticed something strange. The village wasn't abandoned. Figures moved, dozens of them, then more, and soon it became clear what they were seeing. An entire formation of German soldiers, their grey uniforms stark against the muddy ground. Some had rifles slung over their shoulders, others carried machine guns, and many more simply sat near carts and motorcycles. But none of them were aiming their weapons. They were just standing there watching as the Sherman approached. Ridge froze. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. There weren't 10 or 20 Germans, there were hundreds, maybe 300 or more, stretching along the road, filling the village square and spilling out toward the fields. His first instinct screamed trap. No way were that many enemy soldiers just waiting to be found. He reached for his radio, whispering into it. But static was all he got. They were out of range, completely alone. The tank stopped just short of the village entrance. The engine idled low, a deep metallic growl echoing through the ruined streets. Ridge's heart pounded. "They're everywhere," Hayes said softly, peering through his scope. "Orders?" Ridge hesitated. The wrong move could get them all killed. The right one might end the fight before it began. He grabbed the microphone to the tank's loudspeaker and, in broken German, shouted for them to drop their weapons. His voice boomed across the square, echoing off shattered windows. For a tense few seconds, nothing happened. The Germans just stared, dozens of faces pale and expressionless. Then, slowly, one man at the front, a young officer, raised his hands. A ripple followed. Within seconds, rifles clattered to the ground, machine guns dropped, and white handkerchiefs began waving in the air. Inside the Sherman, no one spoke. The sight was surreal. An entire German formation surrendering to a single tank. Ridge exhaled slowly, gripping the microphone tighter. "Keep your gun trained," he said. "Until command gets here, we hold them." And so 5 exhausted American tankers sat in disbelief as hundreds of enemy soldiers, once the pride of Hitler's army, laid down their arms before them. The absurdity of it all was almost too much to process. But in that strange, quiet moment, one truth hung heavy in the air. The war was ending, and even the most hardened soldiers were ready to give up the fight. When the first German officer approached the Sherman with his hands raised, Ridge thought it must be some kind of trick. The officer, tall, thin, with mud caked on his uniform, walked stiffly toward the tank, his eyes hollow and his face drawn with exhaustion. He stopped a few meters short of the barrel and shouted something in German. Ridge didn't understand much, but the tone said everything. This man wasn't bargaining. He was surrendering. Ridge cautiously opened the hatch, pistol drawn, and called out to him. "You're surrendering to us?" The German nodded wearily, his shoulders slumping as if a burden had just fallen off his back. "Ja," he said simply. "Capitulation." Then he pointed behind him toward the hundreds of men still standing in the square. "Meine Männer, they follow." For a moment, Ridge couldn't find his voice. He turned to Hayes and muttered, "Holy hell, they're giving up." The crew sat in stunned silence, glancing at each other in disbelief. They'd just rolled in expecting a firefight. not an entire enemy force laying down its arms. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie, the German officer explained, in broken English, that his unit had been cut off from the main retreat toward the Rhine. They'd run out of fuel, ammunition and food days ago. The Allies had bombed every bridge and supply line they had left. "We are finished," the officer said, his voice cracking slightly. "No communication, no orders, no hope." His men were starving, demoralized, and terrified of the American air superiority that dominated the skies. They knew if they didn't surrender now, they'd be wiped out by morning. Ridge nodded slowly, lowering his pistol. What he saw wasn't a defeated enemy. It was a group of men who'd lost everything. Soldiers who had fought for years, now standing broken in front of a single tank. The war, it seemed, had drained the fight out of them long before the bullets stopped flying. The Sherman crew climbed out cautiously, keeping their weapons ready. Around them, the Germans began forming ranks, stacking rifles in neat piles and stepping back with their hands behind their heads. It was almost eerie how disciplined they still were, even in surrender. Ridge counted quickly. There were far more than he had thought. Maybe closer to 300, maybe more. He couldn't be sure. He ordered his loader, Jenkins, to use the tank's radio to call for reinforcements, hoping someone would pick up the signal. As they waited, Ridge tried to keep control of the situation, instructing the Germans to stay in groups and sit down. The scene looked almost absurd. One American tank and a handful of soldiers guarding hundreds of prisoners in the middle of a war-torn village. Finally, after nearly an hour of tense waiting, static crackled through the radio. Command responded. Reinforcements were on their way. When Ridge gave the report, one Sherman tank, approximately 300 German prisoners, the voice on the other end went silent for several seconds before replying, "Repeat that." 300? "Yes, sir," Ridge answered. 300. And they surrendered without a fight. The radio stayed silent for a moment longer. Then the reply came, half amused, half astonished. "Well, Sergeant, keep them there. You've just made history." By the time American reinforcements arrived, the sun had begun to sink behind the hills, casting long shadows across the ruined village. The faint orange glow of the evening sky reflected off helmets and tank armor, bathing everything in a haunting metallic light. The Sherman sat motionless at the entrance to the square, its barrel still pointed toward the disarmed Germans, who now sat in neat, silent rows. Sergeant Ridge stood beside the tank, his hands resting on his hips, trying to process what had just happened. The once chaotic battlefield now looked almost peaceful, but that peace was deceptive. Beneath it lingered exhaustion, confusion, and the surreal weight of what they had accomplished. When the first American convoy rolled in, jeeps, half-tracks and infantrymen, the soldiers couldn't believe their eyes. Hundreds of German soldiers, some still in pristine uniforms, sat cross-legged on the ground, their rifles stacked in piles like firewood. A few medics moved between them, tending to those who were injured or too weak to stand. The Americans who arrived exchanged glances of disbelief. "You telling me a single Sherman did this?" one of them muttered. Ridge gave a faint smile and simply nodded. The arriving officers immediately took over the situation, cataloging the surrender, assigning guards, and radioing headquarters. One major approached Ridge, shaking his head. "Sergeant, you realize what this means?" "You just captured an entire battalion," Ridge shrugged. "They surrendered themselves, sir. We just happened to be here." But deep down, he knew this moment was far greater than luck. It was the culmination of months of relentless Allied pressure, air raids, artillery, and tank advances that had left the German army cut off, starved and demoralized. As the prisoners were processed, Ridge's crew finally had a moment to breathe. They climbed down from the Sherman, lighting cigarettes and sharing quiet laughter for the first time in weeks. Hayes leaned against the treads, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "You think anyone's going to believe this?" he asked. Jenkins chuckled. "Probably not. We'll sound like lunatics." Across the square, German officers were being questioned. Many admitted they hadn't eaten properly in days. Their supply lines were obliterated, their communications destroyed. One officer muttered through an interpreter, "The sky belongs to you now. We can't move without your planes finding us." That simple sentence stuck with Ridge. It wasn't arrogance. It was resignation. The Germans had come to understand that the balance of power had shifted completely. As night fell, American soldiers gathered near the Sherman, some taking pictures, others laughing at the absurdity of it all. "One tank," someone said, shaking his head. "Just one tank made 300 men give up." But Ridge didn't laugh. He looked out over the darkened fields, where distant gunfire still echoed. For every miracle like this, he knew, there were countless others who wouldn't make it home. He thought about how fragile the line between victory and disaster could be, how easily that same day could have ended in their deaths. Yet somehow, through a strange twist of fate and courage, they had survived. It wasn't just a story of power or luck. It was about the human breaking point, the moment when even trained soldiers realized the fight was no longer worth dying for. That night, under a pale moon and the dim glow of camp lanterns, the surreal reality of the day began to settle in. Sergeant Ridge sat on the engine deck of his Sherman tank, sipping lukewarm coffee from a tin cup. Around him, the camp buzzed with quiet energy. American soldiers talking in low voices, prisoners of war huddled together, the distant hum of supply trucks moving through the countryside. It felt almost peaceful, but the air carried a strange heaviness, a mix of exhaustion, disbelief, and unspoken emotion. Ridge glanced at his crew, Hayes Jenkins, and the others, each of them still trying to wrap their heads around the fact that they had forced an entire German battalion to surrender without firing a single round. For hours after the surrender, Ridge had been questioned by officers and war correspondents who had arrived to document the extraordinary event. "How did you convince them?" one lieutenant had asked, not out of doubt but genuine curiosity. Ridge had simply shrugged. "We didn't convince them," he replied. "They'd already convinced themselves. It was true." The Germans' decision to surrender hadn't come from fear of the Sherman's gun alone. It was the product of weeks, even months, of relentless Allied dominance. Every bombing raid, every broken supply route, every rumor of encirclement had chipped away at their will to fight. The single tank had just been the final symbol, the last straw that made them realize the inevitable. As darkness deepened, Ridge walked through the field where the Germans sat under guard. Hundreds of them, huddled together in small groups, whispering in their own language, faces drawn and pale under the moonlight. Many were barely older than boys, while others were middle-aged veterans of campaigns stretching back to Poland and France. He could see the toll of the war in their expressions. Defeat, fatigue, and perhaps in some cases relief. One young soldier looked up at him as he passed, his blue eyes hollow but calm. He said something softly in German, words Ridge didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. Gratitude. The boy was thanking him not for victory, but for survival. Later, as Ridge returned to his tank, he found Hayes leaning against the turret, staring at the stars. "You know," Hayes said quietly, "when I signed up, I thought we'd have to fight tooth and nail for every inch of ground. I never thought they'd just give up." Ridge nodded. "Neither did I," he said, "but maybe they're just tired of dying." The conversation hung in the air, the only sound the crackle of distant fires. In the distance, the muffled thud of artillery echoed faintly, a reminder that the war was far from over elsewhere. But here, in this small corner of Europe, for just one night, there was silence. By morning, the story had spread like wildfire through the division. Soldiers stopped by to see the sight for themselves, shaking their heads in amazement. 300 Germans, one Sherman, they'd say, half in awe, half in disbelief. Some laughed, calling Ridge and his crew the luckiest tankers in Europe. Others were more reflective, recognizing that luck alone couldn't explain it. It was timing, morale, and the simple, brutal truth of war. That sometimes courage wasn't about shooting first. It was about standing firm when no one expected you to. That afternoon, a journalist from Stars and Stripes visited the site to photograph the surrendered Germans and interview Ridge. The reporter, a young man named Miller, kept shaking his head as he jotted notes. "You boys just made history," he said. "This'll be in the papers back home." Ridge just smiled faintly. "Let's hope it helps end this thing a little faster." When the photographs were developed days later, one image became iconic. Ridge standing beside his Sherman, cigarette in hand, as a sea of German prisoners sat behind him. It captured more than just victory. It captured exhaustion, humanity, and the strange paradox of war. One machine had conquered hundreds of men, but in truth the real victory was not in destruction. but in the moment when 300 soldiers chose surrender over more bloodshed. That night, Ridge and his crew drove their tank to a new position, leaving the village behind. As the rumble of the engine faded into the darkness, they knew they'd carry the memory of that day forever, not as heroes who won a battle, but as witnesses to the moment when the war's tide finally broke, and men on both sides began to realize that it was over. In the days that followed the surrender, the village that had witnessed the remarkable event transformed into a quiet symbol of change, a place where the thunder of war had momentarily fallen silent. The once battle-scarred streets now echoed with the low murmur of American voices, the rumble of trucks, and the shuffling of hundreds of German prisoners being processed and sent to collection points. The air, once thick with the smell of smoke and gunpowder, now carried the faint scent of wet earth and spring grass. It was as if the land itself was beginning to exhale after years of holding its breath. Sergeant Ridge stood by his Sherman tank at dawn, watching the fog roll across the fields where the Germans had surrendered. The early morning light painted everything in shades of grey, turning the scene into something ghostly and surreal. He couldn't help but feel the weight of what had happened. The surrender of 300 German soldiers to a single tank wasn't just a story. It was a turning point. It symbolized a collapse of morale, the crumbling of a regime that had once promised domination over Europe. And yet, as he looked across the landscape, Ridge didn't feel triumph. He felt something far more complex, a mixture of sorrow, relief, and disbelief that it had all come to this. He knew that somewhere out there, other American units were still fighting and dying. The war hadn't ended yet. Germany was still burning, and Hitler still clung to his delusions of victory. But the tide had turned irreversibly. What had happened here was more than an isolated event. It was part of a larger story unfolding across Europe. Entire divisions were surrendering en masse. German generals were abandoning their commands. The once fearsome Wehrmacht was no longer the invincible machine it had been in 1940. That afternoon, Ridge's commanding officer, Colonel Harris, arrived to inspect the area and commend the tank crew. "You boys did more than just capture prisoners," he said, lighting a cigar as he surveyed the scene. "You sent a message to them and to us. The war's ending and even they can feel it." Ridge nodded but said little. He wasn't thinking about messages or glory. He was thinking about the faces of the German soldiers he had seen the day before, their weary eyes, their trembling hands as they dropped their rifles, their quiet murmurs as they were led away. Later, as his tank rolled toward the next assignment, the countryside seemed almost peaceful. The crew rode in silence, each lost in thought. Hayes, the gunner, finally broke the quiet. "Think anyone's gonna believe it back home?" he asked. 300 Germans surrendering to us?" Ridge chuckled softly. "They'll print it in the papers," he said. "People will call it unbelievable. But maybe that's what this war's been all along. Unbelievable." When the report finally reached Allied headquarters, it was filed as a footnote in the broader sweep of the war, one of many stories of unexpected surrenders, desperate defenses and acts of quiet heroism. But among the men who served in that region, the story of the lone Sherman that captured an entire German force became legend. It was retold around campfires, in mess tents, and later, in the quiet living rooms of veterans who survived to tell their grandchildren. As the weeks passed, and Germany's defenses finally collapsed, Ridge's tank rolled into towns where white flags hung from every window. By May, the guns finally fell silent across Europe. The war that had begun 6 years earlier in a storm of fire and ambition ended in surrender and silence. Ridge's crew celebrated VE Day with mixed emotions: joy for survival, grief for the friends they'd lost, and disbelief that they'd lived to see the end. Years later, long after the war, Ridge would be invited to a veterans' reunion. There, among faded uniforms and black and white photographs, someone showed him the old image taken that day, the one of him standing beside his tank, the field of surrendering Germans behind him. The print was cracked and yellowed, but the story it told was timeless. Ridge stared at it for a long time before saying softly, "That wasn't victory. That was men finally realizing they didn't have to die anymore." It was the perfect reflection of what the war had become in its final moments, a battle not just of weapons, but of will, where courage sometimes meant knowing when to stop fighting. The story of one tank facing 300 men was never about power. It was about humanity. And as history would later record, it was in those final acts of surrender, not destruction, that the true end of World War II was written.